Thanks so much. Thanks for the invitation to be here today. I'm delighted to participate in this seminar series here at the Commerce Research Library. And I'm glad to have you all in the audience today, both in person and also online, so to speak. And so I'm here today to talk about how BEA tracks the health of America's businesses. And in particular, what I plan to do is talk about two relatively new and, from my perspective, pretty cool programs that we've recently released at the BEA. And the first, which I'll talk about in more depth, are our quarterly GDP by industry statistics. These statistics allow us to look at how industries are performing. It allows us to get a gauge of the health of American businesses from this perspective and how these industries are contributing to economic growth in the United States. The second program that I'll talk in a bit less detail about are what we refer to as our integrated GDP and productivity statistics for the United States. And this is a joint effort with the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Labor, and here's where we take all of the rich BEA GDP by industry data and combine it with some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to trace out all the sources of growth in the economy across industries and across types of inputs and productivity. And so we'll get to that in the latter half of the talk. So why quarterly GDP by industry statistics? Well, if you think back to the time of the financial crisis and then the Great Recession, which came shortly thereafter, and the beginnings of the ongoing recovery, what we realized at BEA is that we were missing a key ingredient in terms of our economic data toolkit. And so what we realized is we didn't have comprehensive and consistent information on the performance of U.S. industries. Information that said something about what these industries were producing in terms of their total output, which is a revenue or sales type figure. Information on their input costs, for example, their raw materials or their other purchased services that they used to produce those goods and services. And then the part that's left over after that, once you net out raw materials and other services from output, the value added that was created by each industry. And so now with these quarterly statistics, we can gauge as the economy is evolving. As the economy is evolving from quarter to quarter, we can say something about the performance of U.S. industries and how these industries are impacting economic growth. I think about this set of statistics in some ways as an economics earnings report, so to speak, because we got a rich set of comprehensive and consistent data. So our most recent report was from just 1 week ago. On April 23rd, we released data on industries' performance for the fourth quarter of 2014. So in that report, what we did was take a look at the breakout of GDP growth for the fourth quarter of 2014 and attribute that to industries. And so I'll get to that in a moment. Our first report was released just 1 year ago. And in that first report, just 1 year ago, we released statistics for the period 2005 through the fourth quarter of 2013. And that was very interesting because we were able to examine some trends around the financial crisis and Great Recession and the beginnings of the ongoing recovery in a way that we couldn't see before. And so that was very enlightening for us to be able to go back and do a retrospective on that period, and we'll look at some of that today. In addition, the key feature, though, of course, was to break out the most recent quarter's growth rate and its contributions by industry so that we had a better sense of how these industries interacted and whether or not they were contributing to economic growth overall. So let's take a look at the most recent snapshot and talk a bit more about what these quarterly statistics provide us. First, let me orient you on this chart. So what we're looking at here are growth rates. The bars represent growth rates in the economy. So the dark blue bar represents the growth rate in GDP, the growth rate for the overall economy. To the right of those dark blue bars are the growth rates for major sectors in the economy. So with this report, what we can do is break out the performance of these industries relative to GDP. We can break out these industries' contributions to GDP. So what we see, if you look at the right two most sets of bars for the third quarter of 2014 and the fourth quarter of 2014, what we see is that there was a slowdown in economic growth. GDP grew 5% in the third quarter of 2014. That slowed to 2.2% in the fourth quarter. Looking just to the right of the GDP bar, what we see is that there was an actual pickup in growth by the goods producing sector. That's shown in gold. However, that pickup in growth in the goods producing sector was more than offset by a slowdown in the services producing sector, which is shown in red, and by a downturn in the government sector. So let's dig a bit deeper into these statistics. So it's not just statistics for the major sectors that we provide. We provide a set of comprehensive and consistent information for 22 major industry groups. And so here we're looking at a subset of those 22 major industry groups. And so for reference purposes, I've kept the GDP bar in blue. And now what we're looking at to the right of that GDP growth rate are the growth rates for some of the major industry groups in the economy. And so what we see, for example, in gold now is the manufacturing sector. And so we see in gold that there was a pickup in growth in the fourth quarter of 2014 by the manufacturing sector. This was attributed to non-durable goods manufacturing. So in fact, we have the breakout of manufacturing into both durable and non-durable goods. What we also see in this chart is that there was still strong growth in the mining sector. It slowed a bit from the third quarter, but there was still strong growth in the mining sector. To the right of the red bar for mining, we see a lighter blue bar for the financial services industry group. And what we see there is that there was actually a contraction. There was a downturn for financial services in the fourth quarter of 2014, and that actually happened to be the leading contributor to the overall slowdown in growth from the third to the fourth quarter. So why are these statistics important? So I hope that I've been able to motivate a bit about the usefulness of these data by providing a snapshot, so to speak, of the latest numbers on U.S. producers, on U.S. businesses. So our take is that we think that these statistics are quite useful. They provide an up-to-date, precise, very fine-tuned set of statistics on the performance of U.S. industries. They allow us to think about the contributions of major industry groups like the manufacturing sector, wholesalers and retailers, these industries that connect the producers to consumers, and other sectors in the economy. And when I think back to our first release of these statistics, that there demonstrated to us the usefulness of having these data on a near real-time basis. So what we do is we release these breakouts by industry within 30 days of what we refer to as the third estimate of GDP. So folks who understand the changing cycle of reporting on GDP releases what's referred to as an advance estimate, then it goes through a couple of revisions, and then once we have the final numbers, so to speak, for GDP for that quarter, we then, in the industry group, take that set of statistics and break it out by industry. And so we get an idea, as the economy is evolving, we get an idea of how industries are contributing to that evolution. We think this information will be quite useful over time for business decision making, for decisions around whether or not to invest, for example, in information technology type equipment, decision making around hiring. We think the general public will benefit, people, for example, in terms of understanding the industries that they're working within, and also understanding something about industries that they may seek employment in. And we think over the long run, this will actually help informing public policy at the federal and state and local levels. And so from that perspective, let me take us through a bit of a retrospective, if you will, on what happened during the beginnings of the recession and the beginnings of the recovery from that Great Recession. Okay, so as I mentioned, we can look at the performance of industries on a quarterly basis and see how those industries contributed to growth in the economy. And so what we're looking at here are contributions. We refer to these as percentage point contributions to economic growth. So each slice of that bar represents one of the industry groups that we're showing to the right in the legend. And to orient you, the slices of those bars that are above the zero line are positive contributions to economic growth. Those slices below the zero line are negative contributions. They were a drag on growth. And what we see here in this retrospective, which we were first able to do just 1 year ago, we see here in the dark red, we have a large drop for finance, insurance, and real estate. And so recall that the financial crisis began in the second quarter of 2007, and things really started to deepen as we moved out in 2007, so such that the economy began its recession in December of 2007, and we see here in our fourth quarter statistics, we see a large drop for the financial sector in the fourth quarter of 2007. That then seems to set the conditions, so to speak, for what I would frame out as the components here, the components of the collapse in the economy. And so what we see as we move toward the first quarter of 2008, in the light green, we have the manufacturing sector. The manufacturing sector turned down in the first quarter of 2008, as did the economy overall. We see in the darker gold, the construction sector also subtracted. It had been a negative contributor. Recall that the construction sector peaked sometime in 2006, actually. And what we see as we move out through the quarters in 2008 and looking at the third quarter of 2008 and the fourth quarter of 2008, we see that more and more industry groups began to turn down or collapse even further, such that then we look out toward the quarters in 2009. And here, I would frame this out as the building blocks of the recovery. And so what we see in the first quarter of 2009, there is a large turnaround in the performance of the financial sector, a large positive contribution that seems to precede and set the conditions for turnarounds in other major sectors in the economy. So we see that there is a turnaround for the manufacturing sector. It's sort of hard to see there in the light green, but it turns around in the second quarter of 2009. And then as we move through the 2009 quarters, more and more industry groups begin to recover. So for example, in the third quarter of 2009, 12 of our 22 major industry groups were contributing to economic growth. The rate of growth was still slow, but 12 of 22 were contributing to economic growth. By the fourth quarter of 2009, 16 of 22 major industry groups were contributing to economic growth as the recovery began to pick up a bit of steam. With these quarterly statistics, we can take a very in-depth and precise view of the performance of all of these 22 major industry groups. So here I have the example for what happened to the durable goods manufacturing industry group during this time period for which we have these statistics. And there's a major point I want to frame out here for us. So I mentioned at the very beginning that one of our motivators for this for this project, for this quarterly project, is we realized as we were going through that tumultuous period back in 2007 through 2009, we were missing a set of key statistics on the performance of industries. And so here, what I'd like to sort of demonstrate for you is imagine this picture with just the blue bars. So the blue bars in this picture represent the levels of value added on an annual basis for durable goods manufacturing. So the value created by durable goods in the economy. And before our release of our first report on quarterly GDP by industry 1 year ago, all we had were the blue bars. And so naturally, these annual statistics have limitations. You can't say much about the evolution of the economy when all you have are lagged annual data. And so what we would have seen as we were going through that tumultuous period, we would have seen a large drop in the annual level from 2008 to 2009, then a rebound in 2010. But to be sure, that masked the true underpinnings of what was happening for durable goods manufacturing. So for example, in the gold line, we see that the performance of this sector peaked in the third quarter of 2007. That's in gold. The sector then contracted for 6 of the next 7 quarters before beginning its rebound in the third quarter of 2009. With these integrated statistics, this earnings report, so to speak, this economics earnings report that I mentioned early on, we can take a look at a set of statistics together. We can look at what happened to manufacturing, for example, and its supply chain effects. We can look at the gross output, the total goods and services that were produced by the manufacturing sector. Those goods and services are then sold to consumers like us or to business consumers. And we can look at the levels of value added. That is, once you've netted out those intermediate costs, we can look at the differences between the gross output rate of change and that of value added. And what we see here in gold is that the recession hit gross output for the manufacturing sector quite hard. It was a very deep hit to gross output for the manufacturing sector, a deeper hit than it was to value added overall. But then what you also see in this chart when we look at these things taken together is that the recovery has been stronger in gross output in this total sales or revenue-like figure than it has been for the value added created by the sector overall. Another point I'd like to make here, which we'll also tackle shortly, is if you look at the comparison of the fourth quarter of 2014 to the beginning point of the recession, we see that the levels for gross output and for value added still are not back to their peak as of the beginning of the recession. The shaded area shows the recessionary period. Just a reminder, the recession began in December 2007 and it ended in June of 2009. Okay, so here what I've done, to orient you, here what I've done is I've indexed our levels of value added,
And it's back. I didn't take it.
Okay, we're back live. Sorry for that. Okay, so here what we've done is we've indexed our levels of value added for GDP. So we've indexed GDP and we've indexed the major sectors, the goods and services producing sectors and the government sector. And so what we can look at here is the depth of the contraction in the economy and also the depth of the contraction during that period of the major sectors in the economy, as well as their rebound and the time it took for these major sectors to rebound. So first, what I want to point out in the dark blue, in the shaded dark blue line, that's GDP. And it took GDP 15 quarters, almost 4 full years, to come back to its level of output as of the fourth quarter of 2007, almost 4 full years. Next to the GDP line, you see a trend line that's very similar. That's for services, that's in red. And the services line tracks very closely to the GDP line. That may be an intuitive result. The services sector accounts for almost 70% of current dollar GDP or nominal GDP. And so we see the trend for services is very similar. That's in contrast, for example, to the trend you see for the goods producing sector in gold. And so you see that for the goods producing sector, the recession was deep. It was a deep recession for the goods producing sector and a slow, moderate recovery over time, such that it took a full 6 years, 24 quarters for the goods producing sector to return to its levels as of the fourth quarter of 2007. We have this same chart now. I've kept GDP for a reference point, but now the other colors represent different major industry groups in the economy. So it's a subset of the major industry groups. And so here I wanted to highlight some of the ones that were more notable during this time period. So for example, let's look now at the red line. That's the construction sector. So as I mentioned earlier, construction peaked sometime in 2006. We know that there was a housing crisis that was a contributing factor to the financial crisis. And we see that construction is nowhere near its levels even as of the fourth quarter of 2007. And so this perhaps this is a new norm, perhaps not, but what we see is that the construction sector has been hit very hard. Now in gold, we see the manufacturing sector. And this is striking because when you look at that line, you see how hard hit manufacturers was. We looked at those statistics earlier. And we see even that a full 28 quarters later, a full 7 years, manufacturing is not yet back to its level as of the fourth quarter of 2007. So these sets of charts taken together, I hope, motivates some of the important reasons why we believe these statistics overall are very useful for understanding the economy as it's evolving. One of the questions that we often get is, well, okay, so we had this Great Recession, and we've had this very slow recovery, so to speak. How has the composition of the economy shifted over this period? And so here we're looking at two pie charts. And so we're looking at the shares of these major sectors in the economy. And one broad level takeaway is that what we see from the fourth quarter of 2007 to now, the latest snapshot, that broadly speaking, the composition of the economy is very similar to the composition of the economy as it stood in the fourth quarter of 2007. Now there's some notable differences when you think about the differential between the slices of this pie. So for example, we talked about construction. Construction here is in gold. And so you see the construction sector was almost 5% of the economy in the fourth quarter of 2007. It's now below 4% of the economy. The manufacturing sector is now 12% of the economy, down from 12.8 as of the fourth quarter of 2007. We see in the darker red the financial sector, the combined finance, insurance, and real estate sector. It's a larger share now. It's a larger share now than it was in the fourth quarter of 2007. In part, this is driven by the recovery of housing, the recovery of real estate. And so that's one reason that share is larger now.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you for a sec?
Yes, you can.
Completely throw your train of thought off. Something happened, and I just want to make sure that the audio is going, because we have a lot of people who seem to be having some difficulty. It's always something. All right, you're connected. You should be good. I'm not sure. Apologies.
Oh, no worries. This is my first in-person and online digital, so to speak, thing, and so
something was bound to
something's bound to happen, but that's okay. We can go with it. So when we think about these pie charts, we've talked a bit about the shift in share for the construction sector and for the financial sector, and Another sector that I do want to point out is broadly being labeled here as other services. This is sort of, for purposes of working with Excel, this is our sort of catch-all category to combine the remainder of the industries. But one of the industries in that purplish color for other services that has been a key role in the increase in that sector's or that major industry group's share of the economy is the healthcare sector. And so I just wanted to point that important point out to all of you. So that's the last of our quarterly related slides, charts, if you will, for motivating the usefulness of tracking America's businesses on a quarterly basis. I'm going to pivot now to another really neat project that we have in collaboration with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So this, again, I referred to earlier as our integrated GDP and productivity account for the United States. So what we're doing in this count is tracing out all of the important sources of growth. The motivation for this project is indeed that. So there's been a long-standing call for statistics on the sources of growth, and this dates back to the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Solow's seminal work in '57, and also to extensions by a number of well-known economists, including Dale Jorgensen, who is a former chair and member of BEA's advisory committee. And so this long-standing call for statistics on the sources of growth have to do with better understanding or being able to explain important periods of economic history, the post-war recovery, the big slump, the IT boom, and of course the Great Recession. And with this project, we're able to ask a number of questions about how the economy works and answer them, including questions like what are the industry sources of GDP growth and productivity growth? What's the contribution from the manufacturing sector? What's the role that manufacturing plays? What are the contributions, for example, of information communication technology producing industries, using industries, and their role in creating growth and their role in productivity growth? In our very recent work at BEA, we can now quantify the contribution of what we refer to as intangible capital. At BEA, these are called intellectual property products. So what we think about here are expenditures by businesses, by industries on research and development, on software, and on entertainment, artistic, and literary originals. And so now we can quantify the impact of intangible capital on growth in the economy. And so let me zoom you all out with these two side-by-side bar charts and orient you here a bit. So on the left-hand side are the sources of growth over the period 1998 through 2012. This is the period by which we have this report out. We're in the process of updating these statistics through 2013. And on the left-hand side, what you might see are what we would think of as the familiar contributions by industry to GDP growth. The new piece that we can add by working in collaboration with the Bureau of Labor Statistics is to trace out these sources of growth across all industries and across all factors of production, the contribution of labor and capital.
I'm awful, aren't I?
It's okay. So we can trace out the sources of growth across. Should I just, what should I do with this?
Just hit cancel. You're very patient.
It's okay.
As a presenter.
No worries. Okay, so what we can do with this collaboration with the Bureau of Labor Statistics is we can take our data, our GDP by industry data, and combine it with data from the BLS to trace out all these sources of growth across all industries and across all factors of production and across productivity growth. And so on the right-hand side, we're breaking out the contributions of GDP growth into its factor inputs, labor and capital, by type, and productivity growth. Okay, so first, let's swing back to the left-hand side. So the growth rate in the economy over this period, on average, was a bit more than 2%. And so we see that if you look down at the manufacturing sector, manufacturing accounted for about 15% of that growth over this period. So a bit more than its current dollar share in the economy. The share is larger than that of the combined wholesale and retail trade sectors. In the information sector, it's about the same size as the business and professional services sector. On the right-hand side, we can do the same type of analysis, but by contributions of labor and capital and productivity growth. And so when we look at the left-hand side, if we first look at the shades of blue, that represents capital input. And in total, capital input accounted for about 60% of economic growth during this time period. If we were to combine the college-educated labor contribution with the non-college-educated labor contribution, that share of economic growth would be about 18%. And then the remaining part there is the contribution of productivity growth. And that contribution was about 25% during this time period. These are approximate numbers here. I want to dive into the capital input contributions just a little bit, because there's some very interesting things we can say about the contribution of different types of capital input in the economy. And so with our recent work, as I mentioned, we can quantify the contribution of intangible capital, research and development, entertainment, artistic and literary originals, and software. And so when you add all of that up, that contribution is about the same size as the contribution from information technology equipment. So if you break up that 60% of total capital's contribution to economic growth, half of that comes from IT equipment and intangible capital. So then when you break up that half, what you're left there with, if we were to quantify it here, is intangible capital accounts for about 15% of economic growth. Information technology capital accounts also for about 15% of economic growth. So it's sort of a powerful thing to think about in terms of this framework that unifies the national economic accounts data on GDP and its related statistics with data that's used to conduct productivity analysis. Speaking of productivity over this period, an important component of this project is to be able to trace out the drivers of productivity growth in the economy. And so the height of this bar is the growth rate on average during this period of multi-factor productivity growth. So multi-factor productivity growth is the amount of growth in the economy that cannot be explained by the accumulation of inputs, the uses of intermediate and primary factors of production. And so some refer to this multi-factor productivity growth as the rate of technical change in the economy. And so it's important to understand the drivers of this technical change. And when we do this industry by industry analysis, what we're able to see is that the computer and electronic products manufacturing industry is a key driver of this productivity growth. It accounts for about 50% of multi-factor productivity growth on average during this period. We see that there's also a notable contribution by the information services sector as well. And when we then combine computers and what we're sort of referring to as non-IT manufacturing, non-IT enabled manufacturing, we're left with a very large share. That total for manufacturing is quite a large share of the overall growth rate and productivity for the economy. So taking together these two slides, tracing out the sources of growth in the economy by industry and by factor inputs, and then also being able to trace out the sources of productivity growth itself, are key ingredients from our perspective for understanding the underpinnings of the economy, how the economy is working at the industry level, and how industries are combining their use of inputs and how productive these industries are. It gives us a more complete picture of the economy over time. And this is a real sort of call to arms, so to speak, on having statistics that fill important data gaps, for understanding the sources of growth in the economy. So I've talked about a couple of our new and, as a numbers guy, some very cool statistics that we are now producing at the BEA. These statistics we believe are very important for understanding industry performance, understanding the health of America's businesses. And so the first report that I talked about are our new reports on quarterly GDP by industry. These come out, again, within 30 days of what we refer to as the third release of GDP. We have plans at BEA to accelerate that release. A first step would have that release be coincident with that third estimate of GDP, with a further acceleration such that we would be able to trace out the sources of growth once that advanced report on GDP is released. So, as a preview, for example, we know that yesterday, the numbers for GDP came out. So for those of you who follow the GDP report, those numbers came out, and we know that in the first quarter of 2015, GDP slowed even further, slowed to 0.2% as a growth rate. So imagine as we accelerate this program, imagine having today, for example, imagine having the industry breakout of that GDP number, being able to better understand the performance and contributions by industry to that figure. We will have those statistics on July 23rd. So in June of this year, the third estimate of GDP will come out. We will then follow that with GDP by industry statistics that will break out that estimate for the first quarter of 2015. We also have plans beginning on November 5th to release even more industry detail, a large expansion of our information on a quarterly basis for these industry statistics. We're going to move from 22 major industry groups to releasing statistics on 71 industries. So if we think about some of these statistics we talked about today, we talked about durable goods manufacturing sector overall. Think about once we have these durable goods statistics, for example, broken out by some of those industries, motor vehicle manufacturing, its supply chain industries like machinery, for example, primary metals, the computer and electronic products industry and how that's performing on a quarterly basis. So this report on November 5th, which will include numbers for the second quarter of 2015, will take these data from 22 major industry groups to 71. I then pivoted today to our integrated GDP and productivity account. And this account, again, is a joint effort with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And this account we find to be very interesting for understanding long-run changes in the economy. So our new quarterly statistics give us something about the performance of industries and their contributions on a quarterly basis. When we bring together data from BLS to do this integrated GDP and productivity account at the industry level, we're then looking at the contributions by industry, by factor of production, labor and capital, by type, those who are in college degrees for labor, non-college labor, by type of capital input, IT capital, information technology capital, intangible capital. And we can trace out the long-run sources of growth in the economy using this very new and cool report that takes these data, these GDP by industry data from BEA, along with data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to do this integrated account. So with that, I thank you for your attention today. I'm very pleased to be here, and I am happy to take your questions. Yes?
Hang on, can I get you to just talk into a microphone for now that the audio has been restored? And thank you for very graciously handling the technical difficulties that are now back.
Excuse me, allergy. Two questions. Number one, when you refer to non-tangible capital, you're referring to human capital, correct?
No, I'm not.
No.
So the question, so the question in the audience is, when I'm referring to intangible capital, is that I'm sorry, did you say human capital?
Human capital, right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, it does not include human capital. What we're talking about here for intangible capital are expenditures on research and development, on expenditures on entertainment, artistic and literary originals, expenditures on software development, and that's what we're referring to right now as intangible capital. There are projects at BEA to assess expansions of intangible capital to include, for example, organizational competencies, the types of changes in practices, best practices, for example, that are introduced within organizations, and whether or not those contribute to economic growth in some kind of fundamental way. We also have projects that look at human capital. And in fact, there was a project, a paper that was recently presented at a conference in Paris just a couple weeks ago by folks at the BEA that looked at the contribution of human capital in a similar framework to what we're doing here for this integrated GDP and productivity account. And so that brought in human capital numbers along with these intangible capital and traditional capital measures to understand its role.
Second question. Early in the slide presentation, you talked about how this information would inform your public policy, say. Does the BEA have any feeling or stand on industrial policy?
No, so we report. So for those folks, if you for some reason didn't hear that question, does BEA have a stance on industrial policy? No, we don't. So what we do at BEA is we report out on what just happened in the economy, and so we're trying to report out on the performance of these industries as well in near real time. Is the way that we think about it. We report out on these industries shortly after that quarter ends, and then we provide these data sets on industries, on expenditures in the economy, on incomes earned in the economy, and we then let the public sort through that information, and then the public and those policymakers and business analysts understand what those implications might be. Yes.
I also have two questions. The first one is, how back in time are you guys planning to research in this, that maybe we can see the chart that was the 1995 to 2012. I wonder if we could compare to the 80s to 70s. That.
Yeah. So the question has to do, I believe, with this project, this integrated GDP and productivity account. And right now, our historical data goes back to 1998. We are working on a project at the BEA to expand our underlying data back actually to the late 40s. That would be a first step at BEA to understand what's happening in terms of GDP by industry. And then a second step in that project would be to try to then pull together this other information on inputs to production and productivity. And so we're not there yet. As a reference to someone who has done this kind of work, Dale Jorgensen and my colleague John Samuels at BEA. Dale Jorgensen's with Harvard University. My colleague John Samuels, a researcher within our area at BEA. They have a paper. They have a few papers. Be happy to chat with you about this after. They have a few papers that look at these long-run changes over these periods of time.
Thank you. The second question is, are there efforts from other OECD countries, like along these lines? And I don't know if the method that are used here are comparable, such that we can look at ours versus EU or other developing countries.
So there are efforts. The efforts aren't formalized within the international institutions, if you will. There are efforts, though. So there's a consortium of national accountants like myself and others, and researchers and statisticians who are working together in what's called the World Clems Project. And this World Clems Project does this kind of analysis. It takes this framework and it implements it in national economies around the world so that you can do these important cross-country comparisons around drivers of growth in one country versus the other, and so forth.
I've got one question I'm going to do from WebEx, and then I see we have a few more in the room. When you expand from 22 to 71 industries, what criteria do you use to decide on what industries to break out?
Sure, that's a good question. So the first order of criteria that we use is on an annual basis, we publish 71 industries. And so right now we're publishing 22 major industry groups. We do that quarterly. Just to get into some of the cycle that we do at BEA, we issue these quarterly reports on GDP by industry. And then what we do every fall is we issue an annual report that brings in a more robust methodology, more comprehensive source data. And for that annual report, we issue information on the annual levels for 71 industries. So the starting point for our decision on breaking out to 71 industries is the fact that we already published 71 for annual only statistics.
I think this lady was next.
Thank you, and I'll just caveat, I have to go to a 12 o'clock meeting, so this has to be quick. I would like to know where this information is. Is this information available publicly or just within Commerce? And for someone like me who works for EDA, how would this be beneficial to me, particularly for my organization that is looking at economic growth for distressed communities?
So this data is all publicly available. All you have to do is go to BEA's website and click on a tab for industry, and from that tab for industry, there'll be sections of data and related releases for the quarterly statistics and for the integrated GDP and productivity account, among other statistics, among other more detailed statistics. So when I think about your question for EDA, the first step that I would say is with the quarterly data, we now have more information by industry on what's happening in the US and how these industries are contributing or not to economic growth. There's a project at the BEA right now to take these data and to extend them to states. And these are going to be prototype statistics released this year. It's to take these national data by industry on a quarterly basis and extend it in a prototype account to states as a first step. And so by state, you would then have all of this rich industry detail. And so I think my perception of thinking about the EDA type work is these national data would be very useful for you as a first step. And then once BEA is able to make that next step, breaking these out by state, then there really will be quite an expansion and rich set of data on a quarterly basis at BEA.
Great. Chris?
A layperson's question. Where does the raw data come from? Do businesses report quarterly revenues or?
Yeah, so so the question is where did the raw data come from? That's a very good question. So the way that I often think about BEA is we're sort of downstream in the federal statistical system. And so most of the raw data for the quarterly statistics comes from the Census Bureau. And the Census Bureau issues a number of high-frequency reports, monthly reports and quarterly reports on revenues, on shipments by manufacturers, for example. And that data serves as the basis for constructing our gross output, the measures that we refer to as our total output measures. There's also very timely data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the BLS in particular, the data that we use from the BLS in particular include a number of series. They include what are referred to as the producer price index series. So these are the prices by domestic producers. They also have an import price program to look at price changes on imports. And then they also collect data as part of a program called the QCEW, the Quarterly Census on Employment and Wages. And that provides comprehensive data on employment and on wages and salaries. And so these statistics, among some other statistics from federal agencies and some private sector data sources, allow us to bring all these ingredients into a consistent framework that we have at the BEA for measuring GDP and then breaking that number out to GDP by industry.
In services,
Hang on, Chris.
you can't look at shipments.
Right.
So I would kind of assume that most businesses are reporting to the Census Bureau on a quarterly basis something having to do with volume. Is that the case?
There's a quarterly services survey that captures, so at Census there's a monthly wholesale and retail trade survey, and then there's also a quarterly services survey that captures the other service sector industries, and they report receipts. And that was actually one of the key ingredients to being able to produce this account. So that data began coming online, so to speak, began being released in 2003. And there was a great expansion around 2009 period. And that was a key ingredient, since the service sector covers about 70% of the economy. We really needed that data in order to be able to do this comprehensive set of GDP by industry statistics.
Great. I believe we have one more in the room and then a couple more by WebEx. Eugene?
I have one question for you. You say government is a part of the industry group. Do you expect government will play a big part of the economic growth?
So the question is, do I expect government to play a big part of economic growth? Well, I'm not going to take a stance on that. That's not what I'm paid to do. I'm paid to put together numbers on the performance of industries. And so what we're trying to do is understand. What we're trying to do is understand when we receive data on, for example, federal defense expenditures or general services of governments, state and local governments or federal governments, we're putting them together in a framework that's consistent with our so-called national accounting concepts. And so then we report out on what happened for the government sector in relation to private sector industries.
Great. We have a few more specific questions relating to slide 14. Where is the contribution of land, the value of crude petroleum and other minerals included in this, I guess is what they mean?
Sure. So the contribution of land is embedded in other capital. This is an estimate that comes directly from the BLS for our use. The question also included crude petroleum, and what was the other? I'm sorry.
Other minerals.
And other minerals. So crude petroleum is going to be something. So crude petroleum will be extracted by the oil and gas industry within the mining sector, and so on the left-hand side, we would see, depending on the performance of the mining sector, we would see a share of mining showing up within that breakout of the contributions by industry. Now, crude petroleum, of course, is then processed into refined petroleum. That takes place by the petroleum refining industry, and that's a non-durable goods manufacturing industry. So that then, the contribution then of the petroleum and coal products manufacturing, petroleum mining industry would show up within the manufacturing sector.
Great. And if you wouldn't mind going back to slides 6 and 7.
Be happy to.
We have a question related to where each sector is tracked by plus or minus contribution to the economy. Is the center, meaning between top and bottom, of each aggregated bar the overall GDP growth contraction rate?
Sure. So this is one of the tricks or the challenges of using these contribution bars. Mm-hmm. So what I don't have in here is the GDP. I mean, what the question is getting at is what's the growth rate in GDP if you add up the positives and the negatives. And so you'd have to add those up. And we have all that data online in our interactive tables on BEA's website. So this is a consolidated chart, but you can go directly to those numbers on BEA's website, and that would be a way in which you could add up the contributions for each of these quarters. As an approximation, what you can see here is that if you just look at it very closely, the economy was still growing in the fourth quarter of 2007 if you add those slices up. But then if you add up the slices of positive and negatives for the first quarter of 2008, that's when the economy first turned down. And then, of course, you look further out and it deepens. You get a much larger contraction by the time you get out to the fourth quarter of 2008.
Okay, great. Thank you. Any other questions in the room? I have a few other by WebEx. Figure I'll just check in. Okay. The next question, someone asks, is the way unemployment is measured accurate? Perhaps they mean where is it sourced from, since I'm not sure if you can.
So that's not something that the BEA works on directly. Unemployment is worked on by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and so the Office on Employment and Unemployment Statistics releases that jobs report, and so they would be the folks to talk directly about their methodologies and how those numbers are constructed.
Great. And then final question. Can you talk about the kinds of inflation adjustments, CPI and PPI, that were made to get the real numbers?
Sure. So let me go to a growth rate chart just to think about this. So we don't use the CPIs for this program because that's the consumer price index. What we're trying to look at here is measurement of industries. And so we're using a comprehensive set of producer price indexes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and a comprehensive set of import price indexes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so I'll get technical high-level technical just for a moment. So we use those domestic producer price indexes to deflate what we refer to as gross output, that total number for goods and services that are produced, that revenue-like number. And so we deflate those first. That's the first step. We measure it in current dollar or nominal terms, then we deflate it. The next step in our process is to separate out our input costs, our intermediate input costs, into the portion that's sourced domestically from domestic suppliers and the portion that's sourced from internationally from foreign suppliers. And so then on the input side, we then deflate that measure of nominal intermediate inputs or current dollar inputs. We break that out into a portion that's domestic and a portion that's imported, and we apply those PPIs to the domestic portion, and we apply those import prices to the imported portion. And then to derive measures like what we see here on this chart for real value added, so what we're doing again is we're trying to measure the output and then net out the cost of raw materials and other services and energy input costs. So what we do is we take that deflated output and subtract off those deflated intermediate inputs. And that allows us to derive our statistics here on the value that was added by the industry.
Okay, great. If there's anyone else, one more? Sure, here.
This may or may not be something that you're able to give an opinion on. So when we went back to the quarterly stuff, we were able to see some of the things that you could see, the trends in what led through the recession and everything. Do you think that this data is coming out early enough that they could be early warning signs and we could then do something about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So I think that they do give some information as an early warning sign of what's been happening. I think as we accelerate these statistics, they'll be even more useful. And so our ultimate goal, as I mentioned, is to produce these statistics coincident with what's referred to as the advance GDP release, so the numbers that just came out yesterday. And so certainly in an environment where you have an advanced release of GDP, so we know GDP was 0.2. By reading the report, we know what happened on the spending side. We know We know what happened on the spending side that led to that slowdown. We know somewhat about what happened on the income side, about what was happening for business profits, for example, and compensation of employees, those types of numbers. And then what we would have with an advanced release would be the full, consistent, and comprehensive picture of what was happening on the industry dimension, so that we would know today, perhaps, which industries were the leading contributors to that slowdown in GDP, and which industries were leading contributors to try to pick up growth. And so that's the ultimate goal. So it's incremental in some ways, but we believe this first step on quarterly GDP by industry was a major step, and it provides the tools to do that much more.